Hi everyone, Dr. McElhuggy here again. This presentation is an overview of um, one way to conceptualize and think about genre and format in children's literature. I want to be clear that there are different ways to think about genre and formats. What I'm going to present here is drawn from a variety of sources that I've listed here on the slide, and also my own work that I've done over the past few years. So to start with, let's think about genres. Genre is determined based on the content of children's literature. So it provides signals to readers about what to expect. It gives us clues to help make predictions. It can help with comprehension. We know that it helps with comprehension. Um, and the big thing to remember here is that it's about the content. So the content of the story or the information being presented is what informs our understanding of genre. So the first genre I'm going to talk about is contemporary realistic fiction. Um, Contemporary realistic fiction is imagined, but it is set in the real world, so it could really happen, but it is made up. It has a narrative structure, it has characters, it has plot, it has a setting. It portrays life as it could be lived today or near today, and also sometimes it focuses on problems or issues of living today. So the key here is that it is contemporary. It could really actually happen. I have an example here on the slide of the hello goodbye window. It's a story about a little girl going to stay with her grandma and grandpa. It could really happen in the real world as it is presented in this story. So that's contemporary realistic fiction. Historical fiction is also imagined but set in the real world, also has a narrative structure with characters, plot, and setting. The significant difference here is that it portrays life as it might have been lived in the past. It focuses on problems or issues of life in the past, and a key element of historical fiction is that it has a historical person or character, someone who actually lived in the past, or events that are key elements of the story. So, for example, if the story takes place um, during the civil rights movement, um, then it can have all made up characters but have taken place during a specific time frame, and that time frame is key to the story. That would make it historical fiction. So an example is Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred Taylor. Another category of genre is high fantasy. This takes place in an imagined world, or it can also take place in a real world with almost all fantasy elements. And a great example of this is the Harry Potter series. Another example would be The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. They take place almost entirely in a fantasy world. They have some elements of the real world, but it's almost entirely fantasy. Science fiction involves technology or scientific adventures. It takes place in a world that may or may not seem possible, and it asks questions of technology or science. Lately, dystopian fiction or dystopias books, which are a form of science fiction, have become very popular. So that Hunger Games, Divergent, those are science fiction questions. So often the issue or the problem at hand uses technology or science to solve the problem, to approach the problem, or address the problem. Another genre that I put as its own group is animal fantasy or low fantasy. So animal fantasy features animals that behave like people. Olivia is a great example. Another example of animal fantasy would be Charlotte's Web, right? So the characters that are animals, they talk and interact with each other. They act like people do. But that can't actually happen in real life. So it can be considered realistic fiction even if it's written in a realistic way. Low fantasy takes place in the real world, and it might involve a few magical elements, but it's not the predominant part or predominant focus of the story. We also have traditional literature. So traditional literature is written or oral stories that have been handed down across time. These stories have served as entertainment and oral history of customs and peoples. This includes fairy tales, folklore, fables, myths, and legends. And something about traditional literature is that it doesn't always have a known author. So, for example, Cinderella does not have a known author. It's sometimes attributed to different people, but there are actually over 700 versions of the Cinderella tale from across the country. Here's an example of Sam and the Tigers, which is based on Little Black Sambo, which could be traditional literature. We also have biography and autobiography. These tend to be ones that people are pretty clear about. They provide factual information about a person's life or part of a person's life, and they typically use a narrative structure. They tell us why the person's life is important to be written about and give some context for the culture and the setting when the person lived and what influenced that person. Biography is written in the third person, not by the subject of the story, and it tells the setting and culture of the person, what they lived in, and what influenced them. Autobiography is different because it's written in the first person by the subject, and it gives a very limited perspective. So the example I have on the slide here is Through My Eyes, which is a beautiful picture book by Ruby Bridges about her experience going to school as a black child, being integrated into a white school. So that's an autobiography. There's another book that's called The Story of Ruby Bridges that's written by someone else, so that would be a biography. Informational text is a very broad range of text. It includes narrative, descriptive, and or persuasive stories. So sometimes we might describe informational texts as, so the text here I have, the example I show here is Seymour Simon's Volcanoes. Seymour Simon is an author that has a wide range of informational texts available. They are primarily descriptive texts, and that they're giving information about specific topics, in this case, volcanoes. These can be arranged by subcategories, so sometimes they're arranged by subject matter. They often include specific text features or organizational features like tables of contents, headings, an index, that sort of thing. They also include graphic features to support and enhance the text, so photographs with captions, illustrations with captions, diagrams, timelines, charts, etc. Informational text can be narrative. It can present information in the form of a story. So the Magic School Bus is a great example of narrative informational text. It often uses a chronological format. It can also be non-narrative. Sometimes this is referred to as nonfiction. I prefer to use non-narrative informational text so that we don't get confused by the fiction and nonfiction markers. For this course, we're not going to use those as genres. We're using just the things that are presented here. So non-narrative informational text is presented in a clear, organized structure. It provides factual information, has major topic and supportive information. So again, those genres that I talked about are contemporary realistic fiction, historical fiction, high fantasy, science fiction, animal fantasy and low fantasy, traditional literature, biography and autobiography, and informational text. Now I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about format. This is different than genre. Format talks about how a story is communicated. So genre is about the content. What is the story about? What is the content of the story? Format is how is the story communicated. Again, this signals to the reader expectations about the communication style, interpretations, and strategies that they may use. So, one example of format is a picture book. In this, the images convey as much or more than the text. The images are crucial to understanding what's happening. Sometimes picture books are wordless. They don't have any words at all. These can be referred to as wordless picture books. They don't have to be, but they can. Picture books come in a very wide range of sizes and shapes. If you think about Beatrix Potter and The Tale of Peter Rabbit, those are very small books that are handheld. You think about board books that are made today for babies to hold. And then we also have huge oversized picture books. Picture books are created for all age readers. A key element of the picture book format is don't confuse the format for complexity. You'll see this in a few weeks when we start to examine picture books closely. There are picture books that are simplistic, just like there are chapter length books that are simplistic. But the length and the way that a story is communicated are not reflective of the complexity or simplicity of a book. Chapter length books, for lack of a better definition or term, I'm constantly searching for a better way to describe them, but this is the best I've come up with so far. Chapter length stories are usually told primarily through text. Occasionally there are illustrations that enhance the story, like Junie B. Jones. Depending on what version of Charlotte's Web you have, there are some beautiful illustrations by Garth Williams in those books that help enhance the story. But you can read the book without having the illustrations, and you're fine. You don't need the illustrations to understand it. This chapter length books can also be illustrated books, where the illustrations do matter as much as the text. So, for example, Flora and Ulysses by Kate T. Camillo, which won the Newbery a few years ago. The illustrations are absolutely necessary in that text. There are portions of the book that are told in a graphic novel format style, and I'm going to create another PowerPoint presentation about styles for next week. But you have to read those aspects of the book or you miss out on it. So while I am giving you these formats of picture book and chapter length book and poetry, it's important to understand that they are not clear-cut, black and white, cut and dry. The more, even since I've started studying children's literature as a doctoral student and now as a faculty member, the lines are being blurred more and more by writers and illustrators and editors and publishers. So sometimes when you're describing a book, you may need to say, well, it has these elements from a picture book and these elements from a chapter book. So the third format is poetry, and poetry can actually be fiction or nonfiction. There's some beautiful nonfiction poetry out there. There's one called Dark Emperor that's just stunning. Poetry appeals to the thoughts and feelings, the aesthetics of a reader, and the placement of the words guides us in how to read it. Now, so far, if you look at these 3 bullet points, you could look at these if the heading of poetry wasn't there and say that this could be true of a picture book. And that is true. You can, these can apply to a picture book. But poetry specifically, in addition to all of those and expressing feelings and ideas, it also uses compact language and pattern and rhythm and elements of poetry, of poetic writing to in the way that it communicates. So lots of symbolism and imagery and metaphor and that sort of thing. So just to highlight, again, the difference between these two, genre refers to the key or primary content of a book or story. When you're trying to determine genre, ask yourself what are the key elements here that are imperative to the story? And if you're not sure, say to yourself, well, if this element changed, would it change the story? That's a good way to ask yourself with historical fiction. If the setting of a story is during World War II in France, like in Codename Verity, and I take that setting and I change it to a different year, 40 or 50 years later, it wouldn't be the same story. I couldn't tell the story because the fact that it's in World War II matters deeply to the story. If you're trying to decide if something's fantasy or contemporary realistic fiction, ask yourself if everything happens in the story the way that it does, could it actually happen in real life? And if the answer is no, ask yourself what that is. If there are animals talking in your story, it can't happen in real life. So again, the key or primary content of a book or story. With a picture book, if you have one thing on one page that you're not sure about, then I would say pay attention to the overall. It needs to happen on more than just one page, or it needs to be a really hugely significant aspect. Format, again, refers to how a story is communicated. What's the primary way it's communicated? Sorry about the typo on this. So remember, genre is the content, and format is how it's communicated. So some other examples: a book by David Shannon, written and illustrated by him, called No, David. This book is about a little boy who has a hard time following the rules, and his mom tells him, no, David. The genre is contemporary realistic fiction because everything in it could really happen in real life today. The format is a picture book because it is told through both images and text. Another example, which I used in the other presentation, is Charlotte's Web by E.B. Lewis, which is the story of Wilbur the pig. He's initially saved by a little girl named Fern. At the beginning, it seems like it could be realistic fiction, and then Wilbur starts talking and gets to be friends with Charlotte the spider, who also talks. So the genre here is animal fantasy. The format here is chapter book. I might say that the format is chapter book with limited illustrations. So, genres and formats. These are the genres that you need to use for your independent reading that you're doing for the class. So when you're asked to identify the genre of the books that you read, these are the genres that you need to use for that. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for listening and watching. I will upload this without narration so that you can refer to it again throughout the semester.